It's my great pleasure to introduce Yehudis at this point in time, who's going to give our next talk on trauma-informed care and intentional person-centered care. So Yehudis is a clinical nurse specialist within the psychosocial oncology team at Princess Margaret Cancer Center, focusing on supporting patients with severe persistent mental illness and cancer through their cancer journey. She is currently completing her PhD in nursing at the University of Ottawa with a thesis research focusing on planning the implementation of trauma-informed care programs at an acute pediatric hospital. She's also trained as an art therapist and a psychotherapist, and she speaks and advocates on topics relating to trauma-informed care. It's my great pleasure to have her speaking with us today. So Yehudis, take it away.
So much. Okay. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here today to speak about this very important topic of trauma-informed care that I see as a tool for intentional person-centered care. So without further ado, in the short time that we have together today, I hope to cover a few key points, including how do we define trauma, which I see as the combination of the event, the experience, and the effects. What happens to the brain when it experiences trauma, with the two key elements of sensitized stress response and the evocative cues. And then where do we start from here? Where do we go, particularly emphasizing safety as the treatments of trauma? And then some reflections. So in the why of trauma-informed care, why is it important? I just think of the patients that I've met. Every patient, when you first meet them, it's as if there's curtains, layers and layers of curtains dividing you and them, and you almost see just a shadow of who they are. And it takes time and attunement and curiosity, and you begin to see a very different picture. And then you realize maybe what you saw at first was actually very different when you take a trauma-informed lens and you begin to see more than lies beneath the surface. And so I think it's so integral to have this sensitivity and attunement and to learn all that we can about trauma, so that we can actually begin to see the person in front of us for who they are, and to help peel away those curtains gradually and have the patience and the skill to do that. So what is trauma? When we think about stress, we always ask the question is, what type of stress is good? What type of stress is harmful? So I believe that predictable, moderate, according to our capacities, and controllable patterns of stress can actually build resilience, also known as tolerance. Whereas it's the unpredictable, extreme, prolonged forms of stress where we're unsupported that lead to sensitization, also known as vulnerability, and is what we think of in terms of trauma. The other piece of trauma is that it's not necessarily the gravity of the event that defines the trauma, but the level of experienced helplessness. And that one recurring observation about resilience and coping from trauma is the power of healthy relationships to protect from and heal following stress, distress, and trauma. So not just what happened to you, but who was there for you before, during, and after the event. And when the event was a relational event, how do we begin to find safety again through relationships, since that is the way towards healing. So I like this definition of trauma that considers the 3 E's: the event, the experience, and the effects of the trauma on the person. And I'll give an example of that. So in this example, there's a fire in a school, and the fire person arrives to take care of the fire. Now, is it a trauma for this fireman? Assuming it's a moderate fire, nobody was harmed, this actually may be a resilience building experience for this fire person, because he has the skills, he has the training, he has the resources, he has the support, he's successful in performing his task, and he has opportunities to debrief afterwards. So this experience may not be a trauma. Whereas there may be a child, maybe his first week of school, the fire is actually in his classroom, he's evacuated, he doesn't really know anyone, may have difficult relationships at home. For this child, he may experience a sensitized stress response, which may be a trauma. On the other hand, there may be another child, maybe a little bit older, on the other end of the school, didn't really see the fire, It was a little scary, but also a little exciting to get out with his friends, her friends, their friends. And when they went home later that night, had opportunity to get support and to debrief. So they may have a temporary activation of their stress response, but not necessarily a trauma. So we have the same events, but there's going to be different experiences and effects of that event. So what happens to the brain when the brain experiences trauma? Well, if we consider the brain as in this funny upside down triangle as a hierarchical organ with 4 distinct but interconnected levels performing different functions, and the lowest levels performing more regulatory, survival functions. As we go to the upper levels, more relational, and the cortex is what we think of as uniquely human, with our creative functions, problem solving, value-based. And what's particularly important to consider is, number one, that the brain develops from bottom up in development in utero and early childhood, and that there are universally important stress neural networks that are based in the lower part of the brain, in the brainstem, that function as our stress response system and send projections to each level of the brain, as well as communications down to our body through our spinal cord and through our endocrine system. And so typical development, we will be able to kind of have in the background, humming, so to speak, our survival mechanisms. We don't constantly need to be vigilant for our survival and our regulatory needs. And we're able to focus more of our real estate and our energy on our social emotional functioning and on our cognition and problem solving and those elements that we think of as uniquely human. And one of the issues in developmental trauma is that with the effects of those stress response systems during development on the organization of those brains, we end up having most of our real estate having to be focused on survival and regulation, with less capacity for that social, emotional, relational piece and cognition. Another really important piece from my perspective is that those primary relational experiences. So if an infant, a child who is attuned to when they're wet, when they're cold, when they're in need of care and they're uncomfortable, and in a timely manner, a caregiver tunes to them and meets their needs and provides pleasure in a relational way, and that pattern happens over and over and over again, decreasing their distress in a relational way, then our brains begin to create these patterns, these associations between regulation, reward, and relationships. And we associate, number one, that our distress will be relieved, our needs will be met, and that we will receive that regulation and reward through relationships. And yet, if our primary caregivers, for whatever reasons, are unavailable to provide that timely attunement, or to another degree are actually causing harm through their own lack of ability to regulate their emotions, then we learn that our needs and distress might not be relieved and met, and that connecting through relationships is not regulating or rewarding, but actually could be quite harmful. So that is something that we will carry with us throughout our lives, and a really important piece to keep in mind. And I just love this quote, that growing up with parents who can regulate their own emotions is a lost, talked about form of generational wealth. So we move on to the threat response system, our survival mechanism, our adaptive way of managing our survival and avoiding threats that risk our survival. And there are 2 pathways that we take through our stress response system, threat response system. The hyperarousal approach is one that I think we're most familiar with hypervigilance, reactivity, that alarm response, our heart starts beating, fight, flight. And then the other pathway, which is less talked about but equally important, is the hypoarousal approach, or dissociation. And that's when we manage the threats. Typically, it's when we are not able to fight or flight away from the threats. The way that we manage is we kind of go the reptilian way, and we dissociate, we either comply, we try to disappear, instead of being outwardly focused, we go inwardly focused to manage the distress. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that all of us are fluctuating through these states throughout the day. I go from sitting to standing. That's a stressor on my body that I need to retain my equilibrium. I always think I'm driving to work and yes, I'm, externally focused, but then I become really reflective on what's going to happen today, what the people I'm going to see, the things I need to take care of. So I'm kind of going into that hypoarousal pathway. And then there is a honk of the horn, a bike or a pedestrian quick in front of me. I slam on the brakes, my heart starts beating. I go from calm and reflective to more alert, alarm. Everyone's safe, thankfully. I gradually come down, I get back to baseline, go back into my reflective state. So all of us are constantly in oscillation between being more externally focused and internally focused. And what happens when there's a severe threat, though, is we go to a higher extreme. And in cases of the other piece that I just want to mention is for all of us that there has been studies to that present that when we are in a calmer state, then that is when we have our best cognitive abilities. And when we are in a state of fear, actually our IQs decrease, and we just have less cognitive ability, even for all of us at our baseline. So what happens in a sensitized stress response when we have those prolonged extreme stressors over time, our baseline shifts. We may not ever really get back to that state of calm. We're starting our day in alert, alarm, and we're using those strategies to be alert for threats and to manage throughout the day. And then when we have maybe what would be considered a mild stressor, it's going to move us up to the next stage of alarm, fear, terror. So for what some of us might see as a mild stressor, for those with a sensitized stress response system, we're going to have a more intense response, more prolonged, more difficulty getting back to our baseline. And really, we may never get back quite to a calm baseline. We may always be functioning at a higher state of alert and alarm and using either that hyperarousal or hypoarousal method or a mixture of the two to survive through the day. So quite literally, in a sense, our human cortex, cognitive part of our brain, becomes somewhat disconnected in a time of threat. And for those that are constantly functioning at a higher degree of alarm or of fear, are really going to have less access to their cognitive abilities. And I think that's something really important for us to consider when we're trying to, empathize and be patient and work through helping individuals understand. The other really important piece about how our brains are affected by trauma are evocative cues, which are sometimes referred to as triggers. And that is all about how our brains continually form maps of the world, maps of what is safe, and maps of what is dangerous. So throughout our development, we're creating associations based on our sensory input of what is safe and what is dangerous. And that's really subconscious. So sensory input comes into our brainstem from the outside world or from our internal body to those lower levels of the brain. And it's processed on each level of our brain before getting to the actual human cortex thinking part of our brain. So for example, when I smell warm apple crisp, I experience a sense of calm and pleasure, and I'm not thinking about how it reminds me of my grandmother's home growing up and sitting on the couch with the grandmother that I love. But my brain is automatically associating that smell of warm apple crisp with my grandmother and giving me a sense of calm. And on the other hand, if there's something that reminds us of a threat, if there's a person that harmed us, and they had a certain smell, they made a certain sound, a certain noise, they said something, or there's a certain characteristic about that person. And then we run into another circumstance, which, Larry so aptly put, relax, just relax, it's going to be okay. You would think that comes across as a neutral statement. And yet, for some that's associated with an evocative cue without them really even realizing why that would be distressing, their body reacts. Their stress response system is activated. The alarm goes off. The fire alarm's not telling us if it's burnt toast or if the house is on fire. It's just saying there's a threat. We need to act. And the person is going to react accordingly. So when we think about that sensitized stress response system, how the brain development is altered, and the evocative cues, we can come to understand how sometimes a neutral statement, we need to talk, maybe that would bring some of us some stress, but hopefully for someone who's well-regulated and resilient, they might just be curious, I wonder what they want to talk about. But for someone who has a history of relational rejection and has a sensitized stress response system, they may already panic. We need to talk. They don't like me. And for someone who has a history of relational rejection, if the person who's speaking to them is coming across a little bit elevated in their own emotions, emotions are contagious. They may go to a higher extreme. They hate me. It's just a matter of time. They're going to evict me. They're going to call the police. They're going to form me. So I think we really need to be sensitive to this when we're engaging. So where do we start in the last few minutes? How do we move forwards with this? I think the biggest take-home message I could give is that safety is the primary treatment for trauma. Individuals who experience trauma are so attuned to being vigilant to threats and not accustomed to seeing the world as a safe place. And we need to find ways to create new neural pathways. And it will take time as adults through many repetitions. As Larry said, again and again, experiencing the hospital as a safe place can begin to then create some pathways that, maybe this hospital can be a safe place, even though hospitals have never been safe before. So how can we create safety in our environments, not just physical safety, emotional safety, social safety, psychological safety? And you can't talk someone into feeling safe when your nervous system has already decided you're in danger. The fire alarm's going off. So how can we create safety within the relationship? And this is the next take-home message I would like to give, is thinking about the sequence of engagement. And this is something that will come up later in a presentation as well. But if we just jump to reasoning and the fire alarm's going off below and the cortex is disconnected from the rest of their brain, then we're probably going to engage in more conflict. And we need to start from that lower part of the brain, from the bottom, from the sensory input. How can we create an environment that offers sensory input for this person to feel more safe and comfortable? And there's generalizations, and then there's getting to know the person and what that person might need in terms of sights, sounds, smells, proprioception, movement to regulate. Sometimes walking with a person rather than sitting can be more regulating. And once we've provided some regulation, then we can begin to relate, build a relationship with them, which I'll get to in the next slide. And only then, once we've regulated and created a safe relation, then we can try to reason, always, navigating back to relating and regulating as needed. So what is trauma-informed care? Oh, we have 2 minutes left. Okay. Trauma-informed care is an approach to care that's really focused on how can we provide help for individuals who've experienced trauma rather than causing them more harm. So there are several principles that have been established for trauma-informed care, and implementing those are probably easier said than done. But keeping in mind that idea of universal precautions, that trauma-informed care is relevant to everyone, just like we take precautions with communicative diseases, because we don't know who might carry it. Trauma-informed care is not harmful to anyone. It could be helpful for so many. So trauma-informed care in practice, I would say, I really appreciate this dialectical stance of, considering when we push for change and someone's distressed, we're going to be in conflict. We need to balance any push for change behaviorally, any news that we're sharing, with a sacred balance of compassion and acceptance for who the person is and where they're at right now, and keeping those elements together, that compassion acceptance needs to come first, a genuine attunement and interest in who the person is. And how can we practice that acceptance? I think through the skill of validation. Validation communicates that the person is valid as a person, that their emotions and experience make sense and are valid. And what do we do if we don't agree with their behaviors or their perceptions of facts? Well, that's actually irrelevant, because emotions are always valid. We can always validate the emotional experience. And many times individuals who have experienced trauma have missed out on developmental experience of validation. They've been told that their perceptions don't make sense, they're crazy, their emotions don't matter, and they've lost the ability to make sense of their emotional experiences, and they feel overwhelmed and ashamed by them. So we can try to help them make sense of their emotional experiences by letting them know, it makes sense you might be disappointed or distressed because of this, And if you're off, the person will help correct you and help you get back on track. But I think the more validation that we provide to individuals through those pattern repetitive experiences, they begin to learn to hear that and to validate their own emotional experiences itself, and just to resist that temptation to rush and fix the problem, no, it's okay, but rather be with the person, witness their experience. And this is what it's about, that, you know, we don't have to fight their resistance. We can honor it, that there's a reason why they're distressed, and help understand it. And then that resistance can, you know, calm down a little bit, and we can collaborate with them rather than engaging in a fight with the resistance. And finally, keep in mind, we can't do it all. Trauma is complex, and we need to find ways. It could be a whole presentation in itself. How do we support each other in trauma-informed care? Because trauma is contagious. And then here are my take-home messages, which I'll just put up while we open the floor to questions. Thank you.